So we will kind of conclude our course on human diversity here, talking about the concept, kind of going full circle and going back to talking about race as a cultural construct or race as a social construct. So throughout the semester, we kind of started with talking about, well, how do we really define race? Is there a biological foundation to race? And then we talked a little bit about a little evolutionary theory, as well as how do humans vary biologically today, whether we're looking at environmental adaptations versus differences in human blood groups and things like that. And then we finally kind of culminated with talking about kind of these immaterial factors that scientists began using as a way to kind of rank different people, things like intelligence, right? And how the kind of strive or the drive to measure intelligence really led to some really bad educational policies and kind of led to some really draconian immigration policies throughout our country's history. So we're going to kind of conclude here by talking about, well, what has all this science really done in terms of the effect that it has had on race as a cultural construction? So the central paradox that we see for race today is that during this 21st century, we see the kind of rise of the no race concept, right? It's based off of a lack of physical evidence for race, right? So we know that, but the paradox is that race simultaneously does not exist, but is also of great importance, right? All you need to do is ask any person of color, and they'll tell you that race is distinctively a very real thing, right? Culturally, it is very real, whereas we don't have a physical biological foundation for race, but it can mean life or death to individuals in terms of their existence within their culture. So if we look at kind of these modern positions on race, we have the biological theories of race and all resulting classifications of race within Homo sapiens have no significant scientific support anymore. The concept and implementation of notions on race have severe and real effects on human culture. And at times, whiteness has been so normalized that it is not even considered part of the race debate. Think about that. Generally when we talk about, issues regarding race, we talk about issues happening with African American communities, issues happening with Asian or Latino communities. We never talk about kind of the larger, more represented, more powerful group in the room, which is the white people. So if we look at kind of the notion of the social construct of race, right, it's the cultural beliefs and these meanings associated with people of different phenotypes for traits like skin color, right? Social constructions have shifted over time from being black in Mississippi has essentially changed dramatically from what it meant to be black in 1818 to what it means to be black in 2009, right? So ignoring race or this kind of notion of color blindness or this colorblind approach ignores the privilege of whites in the history of discrimination against minorities within our own culture. So in terms of modern discrimination, our mechanisms of race manifest through this kind of system of discrimination, things like public lynchings, public humiliations, systems of segregation, economic oppression, poor educational outcomes. All of these factors play a role in determining kind of how race manifests in our own culture today. So if we look at how we resolve this kind of paradox of race in modern American culture is that race as biology fails completely, but race as a social construct has continuing and significant relevance in American society, right? Racism today is much less visible, but one primary form that we see is this notion of white privilege, right, which was conceived by Peggy McIntosh, right? It's these kind of unspoken privileges that white individuals are essentially born with that they don't even realize that they're born with that gives them certain advantages in society. So if we look at concepts of race in American history, we've talked a little bit about these before, but there's kind of this central contradiction of fighting for liberty in our own revolution, yet being wealthy slave owners, right? So slavery, in essence, at the time could not end due to the economic benefits afforded, that afforded kind of wealthy white landowners, right? John Jay was one of the first kind of founding fathers to really recognize this blaring contradiction. So if we look at what John Jay wrote in 1786, he said, "It is much to be wished that slavery may be abolished. The honor of the states, as well as justice and humanity, in my opinion, loudly call upon them to emancipate these unhappy people. To contend for our own liberty and to deny that blessing to others involves an inconsistency not to be excused." If we look at another influential figure at the time, we all know him, Ben Franklin. He's on the $100 bill. From 1789, he says, "Slavery is such an atrocious debasement of human nature that its very extirpation, if not performed with solicitous care, may sometimes open a source of serious evils," right? So what he's really saying here is that, there's this recognition amongst our founding fathers, amongst kind of the early members of our government, that slavery was evil, right? That there was a contradiction in this notion that you could be a slave owner yet fight for freedom or proclaim liberty for all men. So this is really kind of why, out of this kind of blaring contradiction, this is where science kind of stepped in and played that role of, well, we can tell you why. We can tell you why this is not a contradiction, right? Because there is a scientific reason for why these people are not on the same equal level. So you can proclaim liberty for all, but liberty for all of those who are of the same class of you or of the same, quote, race of you, right? Not to those who of other classes or other races. So if we look at how slavery is kind of portrayed in the U.S. Constitution, right, we have the enumeration clause, which is in Article 1, Section 2, that slaves should be counted as 3/5 of a person, right? This diminished the political representation for high slave holding areas. If we look at Section 9, it prohibited Congress from banning the importation of slaves until 1818. And if we look at the fugitive slave clause in Article 4, Section 2, it ensured that slaves which escaped to another state were returned to the state from which they escaped, right? So in essence, all the way up until kind of emancipation, slaves were viewed as basically nothing more than property, right? And really, when you look at kind of the fundamental underlying reasoning behind all of this is that the enumeration clause was enacted to kind of equalize the power that's given via population, right? Because those southern states, so those slaveholding states had higher degrees of population, so they would have had more representation. Section 9 prohibits Congress from banning those slaves till 1818. What that's doing is it's giving those slave owners an opportunity to create a domestic slave system, right, where they're basically using the children of slaves that are already here. And that fugitive slave clause kind of ameliorates some of the conflict between free states versus slave states and ensuring that those slaves that escaped would be returned to the states from which they escaped. So essentially what we're looking at is kind of property laws regarding the kind of movement, use, and legitimization of property. So this wasn't really, or these kind of enumerations that are in the U.S. Constitution up until now were never really challenged until you got to this kind of Dred Scott decision, which was a court case between Dred Scott and a gentleman or a wealthy slave owner named Sanford. The debate itself was over whether or not a African American can claim citizenship to the United States, right? The Supreme Court ruled that all blacks, whether free or enslaved, are not citizens, nor could they petition to become citizens of the United States, right? The majority opinion was delivered by Chief Justice Roger Taney, right? So in essence, what was ended up happening is as they were, Dred Scott and his slave owner were moving out of the United States or out of kind of territorial claims, Scott believed that he should no longer be held to the kind of same legal standards, right? So what did emancipation actually do? Well, it ended the slavery only in the Confederate States, right? It actually did not apply to any slave states that were still considered part of the Union, right? Lincoln's decree also allowed for African Americans to serve in the Union's armed forces as well to kind of bolster some of the losses that have occurred up until then. So Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, and it says, on the first day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaveries within any state or designated part of a state, then people whereof shall be then in rebellion against the United States, shall be then there henceforth and forever free. So what this is saying, essentially, any state that's part of the rebellion, those slaves are free, but doesn't cover any states who are not in rebellion, right? So it did not cover many. It did not really free many slaves. For example, the border slave states still loyal to the Union were not affected because Lincoln was concerned that these states might secede if he freed their slaves, right? Also, the proclamation obviously did not cover or did not have any effect in the Confederacy. However, Lincoln's proclamation immediately made some runaway slaves that were being held under military control in the Sea Islands off of Georgia coast free men, right? So it was not until the 13th Amendment passed shortly before the end of the Civil War that all slaves were really given their freedom. So it wasn't really the Emancipation Proclamation that granted freedom. It wasn't until you got that 13th Amendment to the Constitution. So just showing you the 13th Amendment to the Constitution here. In Section 1, it says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And Section 2 says, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. If we look at the 14th Amendment, right, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So in essence, the reason why the 14th Amendment is so important is because it overturned the Dred Scott decision and granted citizenship to African Americans. Although progress is made during the Reconstruction period, Southern states passed Jim Crow laws to keep white and black people separated in all public spheres. So some progress was made in terms of granting the destruction of slavery, moving to kind of establishing the legal status of African Americans as citizens of the United States. But in response to this, we kind of see the classic debate that's occurred over and over in U.S. political history, the notion of states versus federal. Yes, the federal government has come down and made these amendments, they've made these mandates, things have happened, but really that enforcement really becomes kicked over to the states. So these southern states, now that the slaves are freed and are moving around and beginning to build in society as well, they passed these really restrictive Jim Crow laws in order to kind of keep them politically and socially kind of under tow in those states. If we look at the 15th Amendment in Section 1, it says the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In Section 2, it says the Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And what's really interesting about this is a real hot button issue that is coming up today, this notion of voter suppression. And when different research groups go and they look at voter rolls and who has been dropped and who's been kept on in some of these states, they notice disproportionately in these southern states that used to be kind of proponents of Jim Crow laws, that African Americans and people of color are disproportionately dropped off of the voting rolls as opposed to white individuals or people of European descent. So what we're seeing here is kind of a reification of this notion of segregation, but they're doing it a little more craftily, using kind of existing voting laws that allow them to drop voters off of the voting rolls, in essence resulting in large degrees of voter suppression. So let's take a quick look at one of the kind of fundamental social movements that occurred in the United States, this notion of the civil rights era. Coming from one of its original founders, Julian Bond, he says the civil rights drama involved thousands of acts of individual courage undertaken in the name of freedom, right? So it wasn't like it was this huge cohesive movement. What we're talking about is hundreds of thousands of individuals, millions of individuals, all acting, all coinciding, all deciding to fight for the same cause at once, right? There wasn't some sort of level of national organization that just didn't exist. Yeah, you had the Million Man March. Yeah, you had a few things that occurred down in Washington, D.C., but really it was just this conglomeration of so many different church organizations, African American social groups, as well as cultural groups, all fighting in their own way and kind of coinciding to kind of push for increase in civil rights for people of color. If we look at one of the first fundamental cases which challenged this notion of these Jim Crow laws, we have the Brown versus the Board of Education from 1952. The 5 cases essentially that were in the court at the time came together in front of the Supreme Court and were given the name of Brown versus Board of Education. Thurgood Marshall argued before the Supreme Court that schools for students of color and schools for white students were intrinsically not equal due to the unequal distribution of wealth resources. He argued that the separation and inequality violated the 14th Amendment and caused students of color to feel less valued by society, right? And we all know who Thurgood Marshall is. He later became a Supreme Court justice himself. So why did we have these court cases popping up in the first place? Well, we had a couple of researchers named Mammy and Kenneth Clark who conducted psychological exams and found that segregation naturally led to feelings of inferiority amongst black children, right? So they've kind of found this, scientific study which showed that there's kind of deleterious emotional side effects to this feeling of isolation that these individuals have within society. So the question is, as we move into kind of modern society here, are schools still segregated based on race? And the sad part is that yes, but they're not based on race exclusively, right? It's based on economy, right? And the kind of pattern that we noticed is institutional racism leads to, this unequal access to wealth resources, job access, things like that, lead to segregated communities, right? With poorer individuals, congregating in poor, lower income communities, which lead to lower property taxes, which lead to less wealth resources available for the schools, right? So in essence, what we're seeing is institutional racism leads to segregated communities, which in essence leads to segregated school systems, where you have school systems that are predominantly black school systems that are predominantly white school systems. So take a look at this article from 2019, just last year, that still shows how unequal or how segregated a lot of school systems in the United States are, right? And what this segregation leads to is unequal access to wealth resources for those schools, right? Because that's the one factor that we do kind of notice, is that when schools are given good amounts of resources, good abilities, adequately trained teachers, students tend to excel. Right? But when you start cutting money and teachers are forced to operate on less and less money per year, they're forced to use their own money to buy school supplies. They're forced to cut things out of curriculum to maintain standardized testing. This is where we start to see kind of these differences in education pop up. If we look at what's really kind of kicked off the early days of the civil rights movement, we have the murder of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy who went to visit his, I think he was actually originally from Chicago, and he went to visit his family in Money, Mississippi in 1955. And with a cousin and some of his friends, he went to a local store. Till, being from Chicago, and things are a little bit culturally different or a little more socially lax in Chicago than they are down in the South, he whistled at a white woman, owner of the store, on a dare, a woman named Carolyn Bryant. The after effect is that Emmett is found in the river by two fishermen. He was identified by his father's ring that he was wearing. That's how badly he was beaten. That's how much his body was disfigured, right? So Bryant and Milan go to court but are acquitted by an all-white jury, right? Later, they tell their story to a magazine paper. Mammy Till says the black people were afraid to talk about it because they knew if they opened their big mouths, they would disappear as well. So this is showing you kind of the difference in justice that occurs in the 1950s in Mississippi, right? These individuals that were arrested, and I'm sure they actually had evidence that supported these individuals' culpability in the crime, but they were acquitted by an all-white jury because, well, that's kind of how the pattern was in the South at the time, right? And really what ended up happening, and kind of the more insidious thing, is that individuals in the African American community that may have witnessed the event, that may have actually witnessed those individuals coming and getting Emmett Till from the house, they wouldn't talk. They wouldn't come forward because they were too afraid of retribution themselves. So this is showing you a picture of Emmett Till that was taken shortly before his death. And if you're a little bit squeamish, I would avoid the next slide. I would just skip over it. But if you're not, I highly urge you to look at it so that you can see the utter brutality that occurred to some people at this time, right? He was beaten so badly that his remains don't even look human anymore. If we look at another early unintentional kind of figure that started the civil rights movement, of course, we have the famous case of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was asked to give up her seat for a white passenger to sit down because the white section of the bus was full. Parks, who had been working all day and was extraordinarily tired, refused to give up her seat because she was because she was in, quote, the colored section of the bus. So she was already sitting where she was supposed to, but because the white section was full, she was expected to give up her seat to, for this white individual. So Parks was arrested by two police officers because she violated the segregation laws at the time, right? So the black community began to boycott the Montgomery bus system after her arrest, kind of thus kicking off some of the early protests of the civil rights movement. So if we look at another, we have the Selma March that occurred on March 7th in 1965. It was conducted in response to an absurdly low voter registration rate for African Americans in Selma, Alabama. Roughly 156 of 15,000 were registered to vote. The march was brutally suppressed with beatings, arrests, as well as tear gas, right? And the result was the passing of the Voters' Right Act. So essentially what these individuals were doing is they were trying to go through Selma and get people registered to vote, right? And they, the local police and local government didn't want the local government to change via this kind of influx of new voters. So they basically tried to suppress the march at all costs. So if we look at the kind of civil rights movement in terms of major milestones, in terms of a chronology here, we have the Brown decision in 1954 and 55, as well as the Little Rock Nine in 1957. We have student sit-ins starting in 1960, as well as the Freedom Bus Rides in 1961. We have the Birmingham demonstrations in 1965. We have the March on Washington in 1963. We have the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. We have Bloody Sunday and the Selma Montgomery March in 1965, and we have the passage of the Voter Rights Act in 1965 as well. And we have a kind of a newer phase that occurred with the Chicago Freedom Movement in 1965 to 1967, as well as the Poor People's Campaign of 1968. And we're still kind of fighting for universal and egalitarian health care in America, unfortunately. So this is depicting the signing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and from President Lyndon B. Johnson, he says it is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country. So if we look at race, ethnicity, and American citizenship today, kind of post-civil rights era, there are a few factors behind the modern demographic makeup of America, right? Of course, we have the historical patterns of transnational migration from different groups of people. We have birth rates and family sizes, which vary amongst culturally diverse people in the United States. And we have the conscious design of immigration and naturalization laws as well. So if we look at kind of current trends in demography that we've noted, the birth rates among people of European descent, or i.e. are kind of whites that we recognize in America, are falling. By 2050, the current Hispanic population size should triple due to immigration and high birth rates. And African American population sizes are expected to double by 2050, right? So this whole notion that, it's kind of, we trace these kind of trends in demography, and you can really see that this is kind of interesting in terms of what's going on. The kind of groups in power are becoming less and less and less, and the groups who are kind of marginalized are becoming larger and larger and larger over time. So if we look at kind of defining citizenship, right, we have, of course, birthright citizenship, which is being born on American soil or in one of its territories. And then we have naturalization, which is the process by which U.S. citizenship is granted to a foreign citizen or national after he or she fulfills the requirements established by Congress in the Immigration and Nationality Act. Denying citizenship based on race or exclusively skin color lasted from 1790 up until about 1952. So if we start to look at this immigration or this history of immigration, we have that Naturalization Act of 1790, which requires 2 years of residency. So any alien, being a free white person, may be admitted to become a citizen, right? Notice how it is saying being a free white person. So not only could they not be in indentured servitude, they also had to be white as well and have 2 years of residency. If we look at the original Civil Rights Act of 1866. It was passed by Republicans, and it sought to make everyone a citizen except Native Americans. And it was vetoed by Andrew Johnson, but still passed by Republican-controlled Congress, right? This is what actually led to the 14th Amendment and granting citizenship to every single individual, right? And it's really interesting because, we tend to think of kind of openness and inclusivity as more of a liberal or a more of a progressive type of political ideology. So it's interesting to see kind of the evolution of the Republican Party, kind of first starting out very liberal with Lincoln and some of his kind of predecessors and kind of descendants and things like that, and then moving on to kind of becoming more, in the early 1900s to becoming more of the party of the rich, more of the party of the kind of wealthy class that kind of turned it on its heels in its policies towards African Americans and people of color, right? If we look at another piece of legislation from the time, you have the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which restricted ethnic Chinese from entering the U.S. for over 10 years. In 1884, this law was changed to bar the Chinese permanently, which wasn't actually repealed until later on in the 20th century. If we look at the Immigration Restriction Act of 1917, it extended the ban to other Asiatic countries, creating the Asiatic Barred Zone, right? Next year, attempted to create an African Barred Zone, but failed after lobbying from the NAACP. This is based on this notion of nativism, or the policy of protecting the interests of native-born established inhabitants against those of immigrants, right? And it's also based on xenophobia, right, which is the dislike of, fear of, or prejudice against people from other countries. So according to kind of our legal scholars, right, the racial and legal restrictions to immigration and citizenship ended in 1952, which I'm not entirely convinced of. And this is essentially the legal argument that's used to combat racially based travel bans. In essence, the U.S. Constitution states that we cannot discriminate in granting citizenship based on race or sex, right? So really this kind of using these kind of this law, you can, if your government is targeting a group that's from a specific area, from a specific human grouping, that can be used as legal justification to argue that you are violating the U.S. Constitution. If we look at another modern trend that we see in kind of how race is treated in U.S. culture today, we have the Affirmative Action, which is created to rectify the unequal playing field that African Americans have been forced to suffer under since the end of slavery. It was created by an Executive Order 10925 by President John F. Kennedy. And what it did, it formed the Committee of Equal Opportunity or Equal Employment Opportunity. And what this really was doing was looking to combat this growing trend where people of color were being denied access to professional fields, and they were being denied access to adequate levels of employment based on race. But it is not like the Affirmative Action program did not have its flaws or was not it was not perfect in a sense, right? We have a court case, which is the Regents of the UCLA versus Alan Bakke. And Bakke challenged the UCLA Medical School because he failed to obtain admission despite the fact that he had better credentials than some of the applicants of color who were admitted, right? So the Supreme Court looked at the issue and ruled in 1977 that UCLA practices were unconstitutional and constituted reverse discrimination. So essentially what happened in this case was the UCLA had a policy of admitting a certain number of what they called minority students per year, right? This was their, quote, minority quota. And what the Supreme Court ruled was that a university cannot legally have a minority quota because what it does is it creates reverse discrimination. We're accepting some based off of simply their skin color and not their credentials, and you're not accepting others who may not be the appropriate skin color but are have better credentials. So where do we see kind of manifestations of racism today? Well, of course, we see it in healthcare access. We've talked about that a little bit, on how African Americans generally have less access to healthcare. Minority groups also have tend to live less have a little less lifespans than people of white or European descent. There's also a difference in the way they are treated when they do obtain access to healthcare. People of minority or people of lower socioeconomic status tend to be treated a little more with contempt and with kind of this invasive nature, whereas people who have better insurance and have access to better healthcare tend to be treated a little more respectfully. We have prison population representation, which is disproportionately African American. We have home ownership, right, which is disproportionately people of minorities do not own homes at the same rate that other racial groupings do. We have job opportunities, right? This is why we have something in business schools called adverse impact statements, right, or adverse impact calculations. Essentially, what you're doing is you're looking at a particular policy or practice within a corporation. Usually, it's their hiring practices, and you're saying if one group does not meet in terms of hiring 80%, or at least constitute 80% of the kind of group of preferred people that were hired, then some sort of adverse impact has occurred, right? And we also see it in terms of wages, with people and minorities being paid on average usually 70 cents, almost to $1 less than people of white descent. So in essence, if we look at a concluding thought on race, right, race is seemingly much more about the meanings we associate or we have associated with racial categories than simply just skin color, right?